You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
All right, welcome back everybody to the Dark Warrior channel. Of course, by now you should already know it's Dark Warrior himself. Today, I want to do another PowerPoint presentation. Um, it just dawned on me that I've been doing book reviews and been doing videos, but I haven't taken the time out to really introduce some of the authors and the great historians of Africana studies here in the U.S. To some of the people who may not know about them. So, this PowerPoint presentation, I'm asking for your patience. Hopefully, you find it very intriguing. But I'm going to just introduce to you some of my favorite historians. I'm going to show you some of their work. But most importantly, I want to just kind of show you some of their background. All right. So, no further ado, the PowerPoint presentation, it is entitled Great Minds, the Great Founders of African History. So it wouldn't be right if I didn't start off with the founder of Black History Month, Mr. Carter G. Woodson. He was born December the 19th, 1875, right there in New Canton, Virginia, and unfortunately he died in 1950, Washington D.C. I did a video tour of his house on the channel, so please, when you go back into the channel after this presentation, check out the the tour that I did inside his home. It was conducted by a marvelous a hostess. She was a National Park Service hostess. She's the one that took us on that trip, and I was holding the camera and I did the editing. So all my credit goes to her. But you will enjoy seeing inside of the home and seeing and hearing some of the history. All right, he was a historian and educator of African American history. He graduated from the College of Kentucky in 1903, and in 1907, 4 years later, he received both bachelor's and master's degree in European history at the University of Chicago. So 4 years later, he gets his bachelor's degree and his master's degree. And then 1 year after that, in 1908, he entered Harvard University for his doctoral degree. In 1912, 4 years later, he receives his PhD, making him the only African American to earn a Harvard doctorate degree. In 1915, he established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Later, the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. In 1916, he founded the Journal of Negro History. In 1921, he established the Associated Publishers, in which they wanted to have their own publishing rights because of a lot of the controversy, in other words, the racism that they was going through. So he started his own publishing company. And then in 1926, he launched Black History Week. Later, as it was called, Negro History Week, and why was it considered Negro History Week is simply because to commemorate black achievements held in the second week of February, which marked the birth dates of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. In 1937, he had the Negro History Bulletin. In 1960, Negro History was changed to Black History Month. Okay? So you're talking about 40 years ago. Or 40 plus years ago, actually 50 years ago. He was the co-author of 19 books on various aspects of African American history. I'm going to be doing some book reviews on his work soon, so be patient with me. There's a lot of books that we have to cover. He asserted, if a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. Which is, I thought was this is absolutely powerful. If you don't know your history, and you don't know the worthwhile tradition, it will become voided. All right, it will be completely exterminated, and that's what we're going through now. So that's Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and this is his gravesite right here. I visited on his birthday. This cemetery is Lincoln Cemetery in Suitland, Maryland, about 8 minutes from my job and about 20 minutes from where I live. So I went and visited him. That's me just paying homage to Dr. Woodson. And I think that was also the same day, or that was the same week in which I did his tour of his home. So may he rest in peace. The father of Negro history, Negro History Week or Black History Month. And these are some of his books. I say some of them. I couldn't highlight all of his books, but I wanted to give you an idea. The most important one, if you remember on my book review, my first book review, I told you guys, get the Miseducation of the Negro. Then you have Education of the Negro prior to 1861. You have African Heroes and Hurons. You have The Mind of the Negro, and then you have the History of the Negro Church. Very, very, very powerful books. And I think anyone who is of a religious orientation definitely need to get the history of the Negro Church and find out how it evolved. But that's neither here nor there. These are some of the books I recommend. Then you had Martin Robison DELANY. He was born in 1812 in Charlestown, Virginia, present day, Charlestown, West Virginia, because of the split of the state. He died in Ohio in 1865. He was an abolitionist, a black nationalist, and an author. The highest ranking African American officer during the Civil War. I repeat, the highest ranking African American officer during the Civil War. Officer. 1843, he began practicing medicine, and during 1850 to 1851, he attended Harvard Medical School. He wrote several books, including a novel, Blake, or The Huts of America, which was published serially in 1859 and in 1861 and 1862. So he was already putting in work prior to the quote-unquote emancipation took place. In the 1840s, he published Mystery, the first black-owned newspaper west of the Alleghenies. All right. In 1847 and 1849, he joined Frederick Douglass as a co-editor of the Rochester North Star. He's already joining forces with one of the other greater minds that we've had, an abolitionist by the name of Frederick Douglass, who too, once again, I did a tour of his home on the YouTube channel. You need to check that out. 99% of the things in his home is still the original pieces. Hat, glasses, books, furniture, you name it. It's in there. The tour of the Frederick Douglass home. Mr. DELANY wrote anti-slavery pamphlets and helped escaping slaves on their way to freedom. He opposed efforts of American Colonization Society, which was to colonize blacks in Africa or assist them in the immigrating elsewhere. He viewed that as a form of forced exile. Remember, I kind of briefly talked about that, dealing with the American Colonization Society. There's a few other people who also had an issue with this movement because they felt as though this was just another means to justify, you getting rid of some of the stronger people and you keeping the weaker people here to continue slavery. So he was one of the advocates against the American Colonization Society. Him and James 14, and a few other people who had an issue with that. Okay. David Walker too. During the 1850s, he changed his views and began advocating immigrating from the United States. Example, in The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, in 1852, he studied the status of African Americans. He played a leading role in the African American immigration conferences held in 1854, 56, and 58. And then in 1858, he set sail for West Africa. So he's starting to have a change of thought. All right. In 1859, after visiting Alexander Crummell in Liberia, which is a giant, DELANY signed a treaty with Alec Abokutu in present-day Nigeria to allow African American settlement and the development of cotton production using free West African workers. But unfortunately, the Civil War disrupted his plans. So he was already trying to make some moves with the brothers over there in Nigeria to get some of us back over there and put some work in. During the war, DELANY served as a recruiting officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, raising black troops for the Union Army. In the 1870s, DELANY grew disenchanted with South Carolina's Reconstruction government and criticized fellow black and white carpetbaggers, a political candidate who seeks election in an area where they have no local connection. That's why if you watch some of these shows from people that's in West Virginia, they'll call Northerners, a carpetbagger, because they had no local connections, but they want all the resources. In his final years, DELANY published The Principle of Ethnology, The Origin of Races, with the archaeological compendium of Ethiopian and Egyptian civilization. So this man was writing so many books on Ethiopian and Egyptian civilization, Kush and Kemet civilization in the 1870s, putting in major work. This is, I've just put this book up because I didn't want to steal too much of my thunder for later on, but this is the major book I want you guys to get, The Origin of Races in Color. And he published this in 1879 by Martin R. DELANY. Then you had Edward Wilmot BLYDEN. Born in 1832 in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and he later on died at Freetown, Sierra Leone. Remember, what did we talk about Freetown, Sierra Leone? Freetown was part of it was the capital of Sierra Leone that was established by African Americans from Canada, Nova Scotia, and here in the Americas that was migrating. Liberian nationalist and diplomat and early Pan-Africanist thinker. In 1850, he tried to enroll in the Rutgers Theological College. John Knox, a white minister, alma mater, he was later on rejected. And members of the American Colonization Society interested him in building a new colony in Liberia, a state of free people of African descent. In 1850, with the American Colonization Society, the ACS, support, he sailed for Monrovia, Liberia. Remember, Monrovia is named after one of the white presidents by the name of James Monroe. All right? And Liberia being what? Another state established by African Americans, both in the U.S. and coming out of Canada. In 1851, he enrolled at Monrovia's Alexandra High School. In 1858, he became the school's principal. And during that time, he became an ordained Presbyterian minister and served as an editor of the Liberia Herald. In 1857, his first essay, A Vindication of the Negro Race, was published. And in this, he refuted the theory of blacks being inferior. And there was a lot of people that was doing that. Anton Furman do that too. He put a lot of work out refuting much of this pseudo idea that we were so inferior. In 1861, he traveled the U.S. trying to recruit. And it was difficult because it was during the Civil War, and optimistic abolitionists were convinced that the African would be accepted. That was some of our issues that was going on. I'm not judging whatsoever because I wasn't there. And I don't think anyone should ever judge the decisions that some of our past generations have decided, because we don't know the circumstances. Okay? And while he was in Liberia, he held prominent positions, such as he was a professor of classics and later the president of Liberia College. He was the Secretary of State of Liberia. He was Liberian Commissioner to Great Britain and the United States, Liberian Ambassador to the Court of St. James, Great Britain, and Minister of the Interior. He publicly criticized Liberia's mixed race ruling class. He had a problem with the mixed race ruling class. And I'll touch base with that in just one bit. He boasted that he came from a pure African heritage, and he argued that mulattoes should not be included in Africa for African movement. In 1885, due to his stance on integration, he was unsuccessful becoming president of Liberia. And for the next 30 years, he traveled back and forth between Sierra Leone and Liberia. In 1886, he resigned from the Presbyterian Church to become a minister of truth. And in 1886, he published Christianity, Islam, and Negro Race. In this book, he argued that Islam was better than Christianity for African people. Now, let me kind of just go back a moment with the whole mulatto thing. The problem was, really briefly, he was trying to get into the rank as a presidency in Liberia. But Liberia was being ran by a lot of lighter-skinned people. And he felt as though he was being ostracized. And so he then turns and says, listen, you shouldn't even be in this position because I'm coming from more of a pure African race. The irony is his wife wasn't so much of pure African descent. You can look into that later. But that was his whole beef. He couldn't get the position that he wanted in that country. So then he lashes out at them. In 1856, he married Sarah Yates. And he had a second relationship with Anna Erskine. To Mr. BLYDEN, he argued that polygamy was an integral piece of the respect for the African culture. In 1890 and 1894, he visited Lagos, Nigeria. In 1896, 1897, he served as an agent of Native Affairs. In 1900, the first Pan-African conference was held in London. That's when you had W.E.B. Du Bois and all those guys going over there. Check out my video I did on the first Pan-African movement. That's what that was dealing with. That was dealing with them going over to London to establish the Pan-African movement. He did not attend, possibly due to the fact that it was not held in Africa and it was dominated by mulattoes like W.E.B. Du Bois. So you can see we had a lot of issues with colorism then, just as we have now. We also have some issues of status. There's a lot of intellect that was fighting back then. So unfortunately, he felt as though if it's not held in Africa and if they don't have the same complexion as I do, I ain't going. His writings and speeches encouraged leaders and philosophers such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James, definitely need to check him out. He's also part of the video that I did on the Fathers of Pan-African Movement, because that's where it began in West Indies down in Trinidad. And he was one of the founders. And here's some of his books right here. You got West Africa Before Europe and Other Addresses Delivered in England, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, and The Origin and Purpose of African Colonization, and I have a few more. But I just wanted to just kind of show you some of the ones that you can get. All right. Then, of course, you have another intellectual giant, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Now, I'll say this. I am fond of W.E.B. Du Bois. Yes, he said and did some things that I don't agree with, but so did Marcus Garvey. None of these people was quote-unquote perfect. They had their ways of doing things, dealing with upbringings and stuff like that. But wait till we get into more of his background, and I'm going to demonstrate to you why I respected so much of this man, okay? Or I respect this man so much. He was born right up there in Massachusetts in 1868, Great Barrington. And, of course, he later died in Accra, Ghana in 1963. He was mixed of Dutch, African, and English descent. Okay? He was a sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, Pan-Africanist, author, writer, and editor. He was the first African-American to earn a doctorate at Harvard. He attended the University of Berlin in Germany. He was probably Sprechen Sie Deutschen back then. Who's to say? He became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlantic University. He was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. He and his supporters opposed Booker T. Washington, especially the Atlanta Compromise of 1865. Okay? And he was a part of the Talented Tenth. He was against racism, lynching, Jim Crow laws, and discrimination. He was a proponent of Pan-Africanism, the union of all indigenous inhabitants of Africa. Okay? He authored books such as The Souls of Black Folks, Black Reconstruction in America. These are definitely heavy hitters. He popularized the term color line, referring to the racial segregation and existed after the abolishment of slavery. The origin of phrase by Frederick Douglass. Okay, he was the editor of the NAACP's journal, The Crisis. The Crisis magazine. Remember, I did a video on the history of Afro magazines. The Crisis magazine being the second one to what? The Colored American magazine. So he was the editor and co-founder of the Crisis magazine, which Inez Prosser, who we just talked about being the first African American woman to get her PhD in psychology, was featured on the Crisis magazine. He organized the Silent Parade in 1917. It was to protest the violence against African Americans. He established the Pan-African Association headquarters in Paris in 1921. He collided with Marcus Garvey, who started the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and Du Bois wanted integration, and Garvey did not. That's pretty much, to some degree, there were some other issues between the two. I believe to some degree. I don't think Du Bois just really appreciated seeing someone coming from Jamaica, not coming from his background of going to school and things like that. You're talking about a short, Dorothy, dark-skinned brother that speaks patois and moving the people that he did. But he was already in connection with Booker T. Washington to try to make that move. Whereas Du Bois was coming from more of an elitist background. And he felt as though he should be the one that's kind of like moving the people forward, in my humble opinion. So just giants fighting giants as usual, Initially, he supported the Black Star Line shipping company, but later changed his position because he thought it was threatening the NAACP's effort, calling him fraudulent and reckless. Remember, the NAACP is still being under control of the Joel Spingard, and he did not want to offset the connection he was having with some of the Jewish connections, including the lead chairman. That's where the Spingard medal comes from. It's named after Joel Spingard, who was, by the way, the leading military intelligence officer for the United States Army, who was also in charge of the NAACP. You see? That's a whole other story. So he wasn't trying to get them upset. He was trying to serve two worlds. And that can get you in trouble sometimes. Then he later joined the Socialist Party in 1911, but had to resign in 1912 because he endorsed Woodrow Wilson on his presidential campaign. I do not know why he endorsed that racist president, but he did. And many other people joined the Socialist Party. You had Hubert Harrison was into the Socialist Party big time. Hubert Harrison, of course, being one of the right-hand men for Marcus Garvey. Definitely got to read about him. Paul Robeson was into the socialist movement too. And, they started getting more interested in the communist movement because they felt as though it was much better for black people. So what you're hearing nowadays about Russia talking about getting into, trying to encourage black people to establish Pan-Africanism for themselves in the Americas, we've been doing that. We don't need them bums to be trying to tell us what to do. He petitioned the UN regarding the mistreatment of African Americans. In 1945, he attended the fifth and final Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. He met the future president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. In 1942, government compiled a foul on the Du Bois after his frequent visit to Russia. The U.S. government did this. He was beginning to embrace communism along with Paul Robeson. I just told you that. He felt capitalism was responsible for poverty and racism. He resigned from the NAACP in 1948. And in 1950, he created the Peace Information Center, which worked with the Stockholm Peace Appeal to ban nuclear weapons. The U.S. alleged that PIC was acting as an agent, and Du Bois and other PIC leaders were later indicted for failure to register. In 1957, Du Bois was invited by Ghana for their independence celebration, In 1960, he attended the inauguration of Nnamdi Azikiwe, was the first African governor of Nigeria. In 1960, he speaks of creating an encyclopedia of African diaspora, the Encyclopedia of Africana. I do have that book, and I'm going to review that with you on my next book review. Okay, huge book. It was a monster. Okay, he refused, and this is in 1960 when he was working on that. And, the U.S. refused to renew his passport, so he remained in Accra, Ghana, until his death in 1963 at the age of 95. Okay, so look at the irony. He ends up back at the motherland in the first place. It's going back there one way or the other. And here's some of his books right here. You had W.E.B. Du Bois, Biography of a Race. You had W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction in America. I got a good brother that recommended that to me. My man, Brother Seneb, he turned me onto that spot, that book. That's a banging book. Thank you, bro. Then you had the Africana, the Encyclopedia, the African and African American Experience. I had that book, co-editor Henry Louis Gates. I like some of his work. Not completely fond of some of his positions, but I like some of his work, especially when he called Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben pseudo demigods. I didn't like that at all. And I had that article too, if you don't believe me. Then you have Miss Drusilla Dunjee Houston. I love this woman. Man. If it seems like I'm kind of speeding through, ladies and gentlemen, bear with me. I'm giving you a lot of information, but you can always hit that rewind button. And if it's too much at one time, please pause it and come back. But I had to get this to you guys. Drusilla Dunjee Houston. Born 1876 in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Harpers Ferry is the area in which John Brown was killed, was captured and later on killed, who was an abolitionist. She died later on in 1941 in Phoenix, Arizona. And in 1892, her family moved to Oklahoma City and Oklahoma Territory. She taught kindergarten and elementary school in Oklahoma City. In 1899, she eloped with Price Houston. Houston founded McAllister Seminary for Girls, leading it for about 12 years. And she hired by the Baptists in 1917 to serve as a principal of the Oklahoma Baptist College for Girls, and moved to Sappopo, Oklahoma. She served as a principal for 6 years. In 1901, she became an independent historian, though. Interesting. And that same year, she conducted research on African history. So in 1926, she published Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire. So she went as an independent historian, started doing research, and she writes one of the greatest books on the ancient Kushite Empire in 1926. And she was a co-founder of Oklahoma chapters of the YWCA, the Red Cross, and the NAACP, all based in Oklahoma City. So she was a co-founder of all of those right there in Oklahoma. So she's putting in work. And she was a co-founder of the Dogon Reading Room of Oklahoma and served as its president. And this is the book right here. You will never get tired of reading this book. Even Dr. Clark and them admired this book. The Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire. And this is not your traditional historian. That's what she didn't go to school for Africana history. She just started researching, and she put a word together. Now you have another pillar in the Africana community, a giant. Author Alfonso Schomburg. Born in 1874 in Puerto Rico. Later died in 1938 in Brooklyn, New York. Okay. A Puerto Rican of African and German descent who moved to the U.S. and raised awareness of the great contributions that Afro-Latin Americans and Afro-Americans had made to society. An intellect during the Harlem Renaissance. Member of the Revolutionary Committee of Puerto Rico. In 1896, he began teaching Spanish in New York. In 1911, Schomburg co-founded with John Edward Bruce the Negro Society for Historical Research. John Edward Bruce is another giant that I'm going to introduce to you guys later. That man was an absolute beast. I was introduced to John Edward Bruce by my man, Truth Historian, and I appreciate it, man. He was telling me about this brother, and I read his book downstairs. I'll introduce some of these giants to you guys later. He became president of the American Negro Academy, founded in Washington, D.C. in 1874. In 1916, he published his first notable bibliography of African American poetry. In 1925, he published his essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past. He was an autodidact historian. John Henry Clark left his home from Columbus, Georgia at the age of 17 to seek out Mr. Schomburg to further his studies in African history. And to make a short story, and just to give you a little bit of tidbit on that, Dr. Clark even said that when he went to go and visit him, and he said he wanted to learn more about history, Mr. Schomburg said, you need to go study your oppressors first, and when you do, come back, then we can begin our journey. So sometimes we got to go back to the founders of some of our greats. Dr. John Henry Clark is like my favorite historian, but it doesn't take away from the other great teachers of him. I love him. I love them all, but he's just one of my definitely my favorites. And he's like the Big Daddy Kane of that the Sympathy video. All of them are great MCs, but then you have the one at the end. Okay, so he nurtured and started to put Dr. Henry Clark on that path to seek our history. 1931 to 1932, he served as a curator of Negro collection at the Library of Fisk University, Nashville, Tennessee, which was an African American college, historical black college, and he helped and direct their acquisition of materials. So he's starting to help them put work together. He granted honorary membership of the Men's Business Club in Yonkers, New York, treasurer for the Loyal Sons of Africa, which him and John Edward Bruce had put together. He was a Prince Hall Mason, and after dinner surgery, he became ill, and unfortunately, he died in Brooklyn, New York. In 1926, New York Public Library purchased his collection for $10,000 with a Carnegie grant in 1926. And of course, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is a research library located 515 Malcolm X Boulevard, Lenox Avenue, between West 135th and 136th Street in Harlem. I will be there really soon, and for all you native New Yorkers who are tuned in, you must get there if you haven't been there already, and check out that research center. And here it is. Here's the book that I want you to get, The Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Just an absolute animal, man. May he rest in peace, man. Good gracious. Then you had Leo Hansberry. Born in Mississippi in 1894, later died in Chicago, he attended Atlanta University in 1915, influenced by a book entitled The Negro, by whom? W.E.B. Du Bois. Atlanta's library was lacking, so he transferred to Harvard University in his sophomore year. In February 1917, he began his studies at Harvard. In 1921, he completed his undergraduate studies. He taught for a year at Straight College, now Dillard University in New Orleans. In 1922, he joined the faculty of Howard University, where he started the African Civilization section of the History Department right there in Howard. Hansberry received his master's from Harvard in 1932. Additional postgraduate work was done at the University of Chicago, Oxford University, and Cairo University. Due to his knowledge of African studies, it being so vast, he was unable to obtain his PhD because there was no school with faculty members qualified to supervise his dissertation. So they figured, you know too much. You know more than we do. We don't have no one that can really validate what you're saying, so we're not going to give you your PhD. He later became a professor at Howard University, where he taught about African civilizations and cultures. So Leo Hansberry is the one that established that. In 1930s, he was internationally known by his peers. Among his students, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister and president of Ghana. Asikwe studied anthropology under him from 1928 and 1929 and wrote his eulogy. So you had two prime ministers coming out of Africa studying under this African American. What am I saying? We understood the connection between the two. No matter how we got there, whom or what, we need each other. Because remember, Pan-Africanism did not start in Africa. It started in the West Indies and some bits of it here in the Americas. And then it started moving towards Africa. And Nkrumah, his other minister, the prime minister, was two of the examples. 1961, then Nigerian Governor General Azikiwe thought Hansberry work so important that he offered to underwrite the publication of his major work, The Rise and Decline of the Ethiopian Empire. Research funding was cut off and would not receive tenure until 1938. He was very reluctant to publish his work. He retired from Howard in June 1959. In 1972, Howard University named a lecture after him in his honor. Yeah, and I think his daughter still lives in Washington, D.C. Okay? And this is book right here I want you guys to get. I'm honoring Professor William Leo Hansberry. Not enough is being said about him. Not enough. He was just awesome, man. Then you have Mr. John G. Jackson. I love Dr. Jackson because he didn't take no stuff. Born in South Carolina in 1907, later he died in 1993. He was a Pan-Africanist historian, lecturer, teacher, and writer. He promoted Afrocentrism. He was raised Methodist at the age of 15. He moved to Harlem, New York. In 1925, while in high school, Jackson was invited to write for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World. He joined other Pan-African historians, activists, writers, including Hubert Harrison, Arturo Schomburg, John Henry Clark, Willis Nathaniel Huggins, and Joel Augustus Rogers. He authored many books such as Man, God, and Civilization, Introduction to African Civilization, African Origin of Christianity, Christianity Before Christ, as well as writing the foreword to Gerald Massey's lectures, who is another underrated historian that many people don't speak about. And as unfortunately, a lot of people have not given Gerald Massey a lot of credit because he's European. And they're not taking time out to read both his work and Church Wars work. That these men were going against the white establishment on their identity, on their pseudo ideas of what black people was accomplishing and not accomplishing. Gerald Massey is definitely one of the greats that you need to learn about and read. He also wrote a controversial book, Was Jesus Christ a Negro, in 1984. In 1987, he wrote a biographical article about Hubert Harrison for American Atheists entitled The Black Socrates, because Hubert Harrison was an atheist. He was considered the first like black atheist, if you will. Okay. He served as an associate director of the BLYDEN Society and lectured at many colleges and universities throughout the United States until his death in 1993. Other books included Introduction to the Story of the Moors in Spain, The Empire of the Moors, Krishna and Buddha, Black Gods of Asia, African Presence in Early Asia. And these are some of his books right here that's on the shelf dealing with Dr. John G. Jackson. The main one I need you to get, though, is Man, God, and Civilization. And then I want you to get Christianity Before Christ, okay? Because you need to really know what was taking place before Christianity was established. What were we doing before any Abrahamic religion was created? These are the books right here I need you to get. Then you had Chancellor Williams. Born South Carolina in 1893, he died in Washington, D.C. in 1992 at Providence Hospital. He was a sociologist, historian, and writer. His most notable work, The Destruction of Black Civilization. Okay? He asserts that ancient Kemet was predominantly a black civilization, which is a fact. He was encouraged by his 6th grade teacher who sold The Crisis. His 6th grade teacher was selling The Crisis magazine that W.E.B. Du Bois was editing. He moved to Washington, D.C. in 1910. He entered college at Howard University. He earned his undergraduate degree in education in 1930, his master's degree in history in 1935, completing a doctorate dissertation on the social economic significance of the storefront church movement in the U.S. since 1920. He was awarded PhD in sociology of American by American University in 1949. That's up there in Northwest D.C. All right, which I thought that was an interesting dissertation. I would love to read that. The significance of the storefront church movement in the U.S. since 1920. I think that would be great. If you can find it, man, please share that with me. I'm going to look for it. And I'll share it with you if I find it. He began his studies abroad in England as a visiting professor to the University of Oxford in London in 1953 and 1954. In 1956, his focus was on African achievements in the many self-ruling civilizations which had arisen and operated on the continent long before the coming of Europeans and East Asians. He completed his last studies in 1964. He covered 26 countries and more than 100 language groupings. In 1935, he started administrative principal for Cheltenham School for Boys in Maryland. Cheltenham is right there. Well, it's called Cheltenham itself, but it's right off of 301 near like Bowie. Okay. 4 years later, he became a teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools. In 1946, he returned to Howard University as a social science instructor, teaching until 1952. He later transferred to the history department. In 1960s, he was lecturing and writing about African history from the position of Afrocentrism. He concentrated on African civilizations before the European encounter. 1971 to 1974, he published his first major work, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race between 4500 BC and 2000 AD. A year later, the book was received an award from the Black Academy of Arts and Letters, which was founded in New York in 1969. That book right there is a book that I read at least twice a year still to this day. And I've had that book, and when you see it, you'll see what I mean. This is my book. These are all the pictures you see in all the books that I own, that I have. As you can see, I continue to read that book. And it is an outstanding book. And one of my favorite chapters is definitely chapter 2. You definitely need to get that darn gone book. Remember my book review? My first book review that I gave you? What was the first book I tell y'all to get? Destruction of Black Civilization. Written by Chancellor Williams. And you just saw his history. Sheikh Anta Diop. Absolute genius. He was born in Senegal in 1923, and later on he passed in Senegal in 1986. Died young. Historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician. He studied the human race's origins in pre-colonial African culture. At the age of 23, he studied in Paris. In 1946, his first degree was philosophy in 1948. He later enrolled in the Faculty of Science, receiving 2 diplomas in chemistry. He received 2 diplomas in chemistry in 1950. In 1949, Diop registered a proposed title for a Doctor of Letters thesis, The Cultural Future of African Thought. In 1951, he registered a second thesis, Who Were the Pre-Dynastic Egyptians? He completed his second thesis on pre-dynastic Egypt in 1954, but could not find a jury of examiners for it. I wonder why. Remember, Egyptology was created by the French after they was ran out of Egypt by the Ottoman Empire. Remember that. And then they took all the information that they had while they was there. They go back to France and they create what we now call Egyptology. Well, I figure if it was yours in the first place, why do you have to start a science to study it? I thought the Europeans was already there creating these monuments and the Meadow Nature. But I digress. 1956, he taught physics and chemistry in 2 Paris lycées as an assistant master's before moving to the Collège de la France. In 1957, he registered his new thesis titled Comparative Study of Political and Social Systems of Europe and Africa from Antiquity to the Formation of Modern States. And then in 1960, he obtained his doctorate. 1957, he began specializing in nuclear physics at the Laboratory of Nuclear Chemistry of the Collège de France. He ultimately translated parts of Einstein's theory of relativity into the native Wolof. So he took their work. He basically took his work and translated it to the native language there in Senegal. Wolof is native language. According to his own account, his education in Paris included history, Egyptology, physics, linguistics, anthropology, economics, and sociology. In 1954, his thesis, Diop argued that ancient Egypt had been populated by black people. I don't even know how in the hell this is still an argument. Egypt is in Africa. Africa is with black people. The people of ancient Kemet migrated from Central East Africa up to now to establish that. I don't even know why there's an argument. Anytime you ask me about Europe, I don't sit there and question, well, were they white? It's amazing, but we already know what it is. You're just trying to steal an identity from a people that already had one before you came there. But anyway, he said that the Egyptian language and culture had later been spread to West Africa. Now you start talking about the Dogon tribe. He published his ideas at the book Nations de Negres et Culture, which is Negro Nations and Culture. Diop believed that the political structure for African independence would not succeed without acknowledging the civilizing role of the African dating from ancient Egypt, or what we're supposed to call Kemet. After 1960, Diop went back to Senegal and continued his research and political career. He established and was the director of the radiocarbon laboratory at the IFAN. Okay? I don't speak French, so I'm not going to sit here and try to attempt to demolish their language. But it is the fundamental institute of Africa. That's what it translates to. I know that word. Diop published his technique and methodology for a melanin dosage test in the bulletin. I have the whole transcript of that. I'm going to make copies of it, and I'll do a little video so you can see it for yourself. July 1973, paper entitled La Pigmentation des Anciens Egyptiens. In other words, Diop described the technique used to determine the melanin content of Egyptian mummies. He created a dosage test to test their pigmentation to prove that they were black. Ain't that something? You got to go through all of that to prove that they were black. Because most people that think about Egypt starts from the Hellenistic period, when the Greeks and Romans were in control. You're talking about late 27, 28 dynasties. There's 30 dynasties. There was no such thing as a Greek or an Egyptian or a Greek or a Roman when the earlier dynasties was established. In 1974, Diop was one of the about 20 participants in the UNESCO United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Symposium in Cairo, where he presented his theories and specialists in Egyptology. Hold on, let me show you something. That's why I put this on my shirt. This is the postage stamp of the UNESCO from 1946 to 1966. The UNESCO, you have to know more about what they was doing. He forcefully his forceful assertions that the original population of the Nile Delta was black and the Egyptians remained black-skinned until Egypt lost its independence. It was criticized by many participants, of course, because remember, this UNESCO meeting is all these European nations who are coming together deciding about what's black and what isn't. They're manipulating cultural identity. He also wrote a chapter entitled Origin of the Ancient Egyptians. His first work, translated to English, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, was published in 1974. Charles Bonnet's discovery at the site of Kerma shed some light on the theories of DIOP. DIOP supported his arguments with references to ancient authors such as Herodotus and Strabo. Herodotus argued that the Colchian people were related to the Egyptians. He said the Colchians were black with curly hair. That's what Herodotus said. He suggested that the peoples of Nile Valley were more regionalized population sharing a number of genetic and cultural traits. Of course, because they are all migrants, they are all immigrants or migrating from the central location of southern Africa, of the Nile. That's why. He also argued, linguistically speaking, he believed that the Wolof language of contemporary West Africa is related to ancient Egyptian. Diop holds that the Greeks learned from a superior Egyptian civilization. He does not argue that Greek culture is simply a derivative of Egypt. Diop's work has been subjected to criticism from a number of scholars. Shocker. Diop has been awarded the Grand Prix de l'Amour 2015, and University Sheikh Anta Diop of Dakar bears his name. And these are some of his books I want you to get. Especially Civilization or Barbarism. Especially that. The African Origin of Civilization, Myth and Reality. Gotta get it. My binder's coming to loose on it now. I've been going through that so much. This man was an absolute genius. Now you have Joel Augustus Rogers, a.k.a. J.A. Rogers. That man was brilliant too. Born in Jamaica, 1880, and later died in New York City in 1966. He was an author, journalist, and historian. And he moved to the U.S. in 1906. He lived in Chicago and New York. He was born a mixed race. He became a naturalized citizen in 1916 during the Harlem Renaissance. He was a close personal friend. He was a personal friend of Hubert Harrison. He worked as a Pullman porter and a reporter of the Chicago Enterprise. And he definitely got involved with the Pullman porter situation too. His travels as a Pullman porter allowed him to travel and research, resulting in many self-published books. His first book, From Superman to Man, which was written in 1917. Of course, that book, it attacked the notions of African inferiority. In fact, he went so much to even question, why are you even involving yourself in the Christian religion? Because it puts you in an inferiority position. 1920, Rogers worked as a journalist on the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Enterprise. He was a sub-editor of the Marcus Garvey short-lived Daily Negro Times. He covered the coronation of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia for New York Amsterdam News. He wrote several newspapers and journals: The Crisis, The American Mercury, The Messenger magazine, The Negro World, and The Survey graphic. I have both The Crisis, the Messenger magazine, and The Negro World. He also interviewed Marcus Garvey while he was in prison. In New Amsterdam News, New York Amsterdam News, 1926. Rogers served as on the few black U.S. war correspondents during World War II. He created a syndicated newspaper cartoon entitled Your History, which had multiple vignettes in each cartoon episode recounting short items about African Americans from their research. He wrote books as 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, Sex and Race, The Worlds of Great Men of Color. And of course, he talked about many Negroes such as Aesop, Cleopatra, and Hannibal. He spoke about partial ancestry of prominent Europeans such as Alexander Pushkin. I just did a video on Alexander Pushkin, him being the father of Russian literature. Watch that video. Alexander Dumas, he is the author of what? The Three Musketeers. He was mixed too. British royalty such as Charlotte of Mecklenburg. She was the queen of England at one time. She was like the first one, not the one that we talking about nowadays. All of them having of African origin. Many books would examine the origin of racial hierarchy and the color problem. He was a meticulous researcher. He was a great scholar and a concise writer. He gathered the brand of history, uncollected, unexamined history of the world, and his interest was the history of black people. Members of the professional associations including Paris Society of Anthropology, American Geographical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Academy of Political Science. And here's some of his books that I have of his. World's Great Men of Color, Africa's Gift to America. Remember, that was the cherry on top on the first book review that I did. Africa's Gift to America by J.E. Rogers. Banging. World Great Men of Color, Sex and Race, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Then also, too, don't forget From Superman to Man and Nature Knows No Colored Line. The one great thing I like about, well, there's many. Let me take that back. One of the great things that I really enjoyed about the Ancestor is the fact that when he made things simplistic. He didn't make things complicated. Dr. John G. Jackson does that too. Now we have another giant on our hand, Dr. Joseph Alfredo Antonio Ben Yakadin, aka Dr. Ben. Born in Ethiopia in 1918, he died in 2015. I just missed him when he was up in the Bronx. I called up there to the home that he was in, and I just missed him by 2 months because I was going to drive up there to visit him and just missed him. Anyway, he's a writer, historian, and activist. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1940. He's the author of 49 books, primarily on the ancient Nile Valley of civilization and their influence on Western cultures. He was a professor at the Cornell University from 1973 to 1987 in the Africana Studies and Research Center. He also taught at Rutgers University. 1977, he accepted an honorary faculty position with the Israelite Rabbinica Academy of Beth Shalom Hebrew Congregation in Brooklyn. Why? Because he was originally of Jewish faith. He wrote a book called Black Jews. I think it's called Black Jews, if I'm not mistaken. But I'll correct myself soon on that. Let me give me a thing. No, it's called We the Black Jews. That was the name of the book. He appeared on the Guild Nobles weekly public affairs, which I love that goddamn show. I'm working on something now. Please also, guys, go to my other YouTube channel that I just started called Real Reasons TV. Subscribe to that channel. I got 2 videos up right now. I'm working on the 3rd one on some real life issues, okay? Real Reason TV. Check that out. In 1980s, he led guided tours to the Nile Valleys. He had 15 trips to Egypt 3 times a summer. 2002, he donated his library of more than 35,000 volumes, manuscripts, and ancient scrolls to the Nation of Islam. These are some of his books right here, ladies and gentlemen. Black Man of the Nile, Africa, Mother of the Western Civilization, African Origins and the Major Western Religions, so on and so forth. Okay? These are the things you need to add to your library, ladies and gentlemen. That's why I do my book reviews. There's no excuses. Last but not least, pulling up the rear, Dr. John Henrik Clark. Born in Alabama in 1915, he died in Manhattan in 1998. He moved to Harlem in 1993, part of the Great Migration. A lot of people from down south coming up north. He was a professor of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College of the City University of New York in 1969 to 1986, and he served as the founding chairman of the department. Carter G. Woodson, Distinguished Visiting Professor of African Histories at Cornell University Africana Studies and a Research Center. Okay. 1968, he was the founder of the African Heritage of Studies Association and the Black Caucus of African Studies and Association. He was a professor emeritus at Hunter College in 1994. He earned his doctorate from California Miramar University and his bachelor's degree there too in 1992. Okay. As an autodidact, One of his mentors included who? Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. So, guys, up until 1994, he doesn't get his doctorate degree. So look how much that information he was dropping up to that point. You know, spend time in the military, teaching, writing poetry, doing all that type of stuff, and look what he did for us before he even get his doctorate degree. He served as a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army and attained the rank of Master Sergeant. He was a co-founder of the Harlem Quarterly. He was book review editor of the Negro History Bulletin in 1948 to 1950. I'm sorry about the misprint, guys. I really apologize for that. And the associate editor of the magazine Freedom's Way. Featured writer for the black-owned Pittsburgh Courier. He taught at the New School for Social Research from 1956 to 1958. He met Kwame Nkrumah in West Africa in 1958 to 1959. As a journalist for the Ghana Evening News, he lectured at University of Ghana and other parts of Africa, including Nigeria. He and Leonard Jeffries founded associations to support black culture. And Leonard Jeffries is another giant that you need to take a look at. In fact, I'm reading his book right now. Hold on. I'm reading this book right now by Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And the reason why you need to really look into Dr. Leonard Jeffries is because he also went through a lot of heck with the Jewish community. He had to sue them because of what was going on up there up at the college, and won. But that's a whole. But I'm not going to get into that. Leonard Jeffries, man, that elder is phenomenal. So I'm reading his book right now. And this is Dr. John Henry Clark's, some of his books that I wanted to demonstrate to you guys. The main one I want you to get first is Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. When I'm always in the mindset of when I hear the word Holocaust, I'm just conditioned to always thinking about the African Holocaust. I had someone ask me one time downtown, could you point me to the Holocaust Museum? I pointed to the African American Museum. And they just looked at me. And she was like, I thought there was another one. I was like, oh, you're talking about that one. That's fine. I'm not marginalizing it. I'm not making fun. But what I'm saying is that what we've gone through is not being deemed as a Holocaust. And we need to look at it as such because it is. That's one of the books I want you to get. And Who Betrayed the African World Revolution. All right? And the other books in which he has written. He's just an absolutely phenomenal man. May he rest in peace. I'll be seeing his gravesite soon too. I'll be paying homage. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I didn't bore you too much, but the saga does continue. These giants right here, these are the three wise men as far as I'm concerned. Never forget them with Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben in the middle, and Professor or Dr. Chancellor Williams over to the far right. I hope you really enjoyed this. Please like, share, subscribe to the channel, download the Dark Warrior Perspective app, go to my other YouTube channel, Real Reasons TV. I'm just beginning that channel to really start talking about social content. You got any questions or concerns, I'm at Dark Warrior Perspective at gmail.com, or just make a note at the bottom of the screen, man, in the comments section. But with no further ado, thank you for tuning in for another presentation. And with that, I say peace.